Starfield may have accidentally become one of the best arguments for Star Citizen development model. I know that sounds literally insane, but hear me out. Because for years, Star Citizen has been the game people point to when they want to make fun of development hell. Too much money, time, scope, promises, systems, and delays. And then Starfield came out. The finished Bethesda space RPG. Massive studio, legendary director, the quote-unquote proven engine, a huge publisher, a clean release window, and a game that actually shipped. And yet somehow, after all of that, conversation around Starfield became one of the most interesting warnings in modern game development. Because Starfield did release, but did not become the space game people imagined. That is where this gets interesting. Because the question is not just, was Starfield good or bad? The question is, did Starfield expose what happens when a studio tries to force a space game into a technology that was never truly built for that fantasy? And if that is true, then we have to ask the uncomfortable follow-up. Was CIG right to take the harder road with Star Citizen in Squadron 42? Not the faster, cleaner road, not the road that looked better in headlines, the harder road. The road where they looked at CryEngine and said, this is not enough. The road where they decided they were not just making a map, they were making planets, making levels, making a universe, and making ships and vehicles. They were making ships as locations, vehicles, homes, cargo containers, combat platforms, social spaces, and physical objects moving through a simulator world. And that decision may be the difference between Starfield and Star Citizen, because Starfield, at its core, wanted to sell the fantasy of space exploration. You see a planet, you go there, you explore, and you live amongst the stars. That was a promise. But the moment players got their hands on it, a lot of people felt the seams. Menus, loading screens, fast travel, separate cells, rooms, planets, and spaces. The game told you that space was vast, but the experience often felt segmented. It felt like the universe was not really one connected place. It felt like a collection of boxes. That is not just a design issue, that is a technology issue. Bethesda's engine has strengths, real strengths. It can track objects, create persistent rooms, support modding, it can build dense RPG spaces, and create those classic moments where you walk into a room, pick up every cup, move every cheese wheel, steal every fork, and somehow the game remembers that you're a lunatic. That stuff matters. That is part of what makes Bethesda games feel like, Bethesda games. But every engine has a cost. And Starfield's problem is that the fantasy it was selling may have been the wrong fantasy for that engine. The creation engine was built around spaces, rooms, cells, interiors, dungeons, towns, and regions. That works beautifully when the fantasy is walk out of a village, see a mountain, find a cave, enter a dungeon, loot everything, and come back. That is Elder Scrolls. That is Fallout. That is the Bethesda loop. But space is a little bit different. Space asks for scale, asks for travel, seamlessness. Space asks for the feeling that the ship matters, that the distance matters. The planet is just a background image. The journey is not just a loading screen between pieces of content. And that is where Starfield struggled. Not because it had no content, not because nobody worked hard, not because Bethesda is incapable of making great games, but because the game's core dream was fighting the foundation underneath it. That is a key point. You could add more missions, vehicles, weapons, enemies, a space station, a cruise mode, paid quests, more handcrafted content. But if the foundation still feels like disconnected cells wearing a spacesuit, then you're not really fixing the core issue. You are decorating the cage. And that is why the phrase Starfield 2.0 is so interesting. Because people wanted a cyberpunk style combat. They wanted a No Man's Sky style redemption. They wanted the game to transition into the thing they imagined before launch. But some games cannot be transformed that way. Cyberpunk could fix system, performance, police, progression, perks, and content because Night City was already a dense, connected, authored world. No Man's Sky could build outward because Foundation was already procedurally spaced exploration. But Starfield's issue is deeper. The game is already structured the way it is structured. Its planets are already built the way they are built. Its travel is already abstracted the way it is abstracted. Its content is already spread across the universe the way it is spread. So the problem is not that Starfield needs more stuff. The problem is that the stuff is organized in a way that often weakens the fantasy. And that is where Star Citizen enters the conversation. The CIG made the opposite decision. They did not say, how do we make a space game fit inside the engine? They said, how do we make the engine fit the space game? That's a massive difference. It explains a lot. It explains why Star Citizen takes so long. It explains why development has been messy. It explains why so many features feel like they're always waiting on another system. It explains why the project became bigger than the people expected. It explains why the game can feel like a miracle one minute and a complete disaster the next. Because CIG did not build Star Citizen like a normal game. They tried to build the foundation first. The planets, the ship interiors, physicalized cargo, object persistence, first person and vehicle gameplay in the same space, zero-G movement, multi-crew ships, player housing inside ships, space-to-ground transition, stations, cities, moons, planets, and ships all existing in one connected experience. And eventually, hope, server meshing. That is not just content, that is an architecture. And architecture is slow, it's expensive, it's painful. It is the kind of thing the players do not always appreciate because when it works, it disappears. Nobody praises the foundation of a building when they walk into a skyscraper. They just expect it not to collapse. But if the foundation is wrong, everything above it suffers. And that may be the lesson of Starfield. Bethesda had a proven foundation, but maybe it was a wrong foundation for the game they tried to make. CIG had an engine that was not ready. But instead of building the game around the engine's limitation, they started tearing the engine apart and rebuilding it around the vision. That is why Star Citizen is so controversial, because from the outside it looks insane. Why are they still building tools? Why are they still building backend systems? Why are they still working on server meshing? Why are they still reworking cargo? Why are they still changing inventory? Why are they replacing UI systems? Why are they still building tech after all these years? But then you look at Starfield and you start to understand the other side of the argument. What happens if you don't do that? What happens if your ship, the compromise? What happens if you say good enough? What happens if the game releases, it technically works, it sells well, gets decent reviews, but the audience still walks away saying, that is not what I want this space to feel like. That is a nightmare CIG has been trying to avoid. And to be clear, this doesn't mean that Star Citizen is automatically proven right. Star Citizen has major problems. Stability is still a problem. Missions are still a problem. Inventory, still. Trade elevators, well, we know. If you played it, you know. Onboarding, there isn't any. Performance can still be inconsistent. The game still breaks in ways that people question the whole project, and none of this matters if CIG never finishes. That has to be said. A brilliant foundation that never becomes a finished building is still a construction site. But the argument is not that CIG has already won. The argument is that Starfield may have proven why CIG chose the painful path. Because if Squadron 42 and Star Citizen eventually work, the advantage is not going to be one more mission, one more ship. It's going to be the fact that the game world itself supports the fantasy. When you walk into a ship, that ship is not a menu, it is a place. When you fly out from a hangar, you are not selecting a destination from a list, you are leaving a physical location. When you enter the atmosphere, you're not just watching a loading screen. When you are descending through space into weather, terrain, gravity, and danger, when you land, your ship is still there, your cargo is still there, your friend can still walk around inside it, your mission can still continue. That is the dream. And that is what Starfield could never fully deliver, not because it lacked imagination, but because its structure kept reminding players where the borders were. Star Citizen's promise has always been about removing those borders. That's the difference. Starfield says, here's a space as an RPG map. Star Citizen says, here's space as a place. That difference matters because immersion is not just graphics. Immersion is continuity. It is the feeling that the world does not stop existing just because you change locations. It is the feeling that the ship, the planet, the cargo, the player, the mission, and the environment are all part of the same reality. That is what makes Star Citizen special when it works. You wake up in a hab, you take the train, you reach the spaceport, you call your ship, you walk into the hangar, you board it, take off, you leave the atmosphere, you quantum travel, you arrive at the moon, you land, you step out. You look back at the ship that physically brought you there. That sequence is the whole argument. It's not perfect. Sometimes the elevator kills you. Sometimes the mission breaks. Sometimes the server melts. Sometimes the game reminds you very loudly that it's still unfinished. But the idea is fundamentally different. And Starfield made that clearer. Because Starfield gave players the polished, traditional, big studio version of a space RPG. A lot of players still came away saying, why does this feel so small? That is the paradox. Starfield is huge, but often feels small. Star Citizen is unfinished, but often feels massive. That's not just about map size, it's about connection. 1,000 planets do not matter if they feel disconnected. One moon can feel enormous if the journey to reach it feels real. That is the lesson. Size is not scale, content is not depth. A loading screen is not travel. The planet is not exploration just because you can land on it. A ship is not meaningful just because you can customize it. The systems have to support the fantasy. And maybe that is where CIG was right. Maybe Chris Roberts understood something that looked unreasonable at that time. That if you're going to make space game, people imagine in their heads you cannot fake too much of it. You cannot menu your way around the hardest parts. You cannot build a universe out of shortcuts and expect people not to notice. You cannot sell people on living space if the space is just a collection of separated rooms. So CIG shows to go beyond CryEngine, beyond a normal FPS engine, beyond the limits of what the original technology was designed to do. And that decision has cost them time, money, reputation, and criticism. It gave people endless ammunition to call the project impossible. But after Starfield, that choice looks different. It still looks risky, messy, expensive, and irrational. But because of that, we now have what the other version can look like. We have seen what happens when a legendary RPG studio tries to build a space epic inside technology better suited for compartmentalized RPG spaces. We have seen a game that can be commercially successful, professionally made, and still fail to capture the fantasy people wanted from it. And that's important because success on paper is not the same as success in the player's imagination. Starfield sold. Starfield got played. Starfield had defenders, and it had some good ideas, but did not become the cultural space game moment Bethesda wanted. It did not replace Skyrim. It did not become the new Fallout. It did not dominate the conversation as a definitive sci-fi PG. Instead, it became a warning about scope, engine limitations, procedural emptiness, and also building the wrong game for the tools that you have. And maybe that is a real comparison to Star Citizen. But Star Citizen has the opposite problem. Bethesda had a finished game whose technology limited the fantasy. CIG has a fantasy so large, technology had to be rebuilt underneath it. One ship faster and disappointed people. The other is taking forever and exhausting people. Neither path is clean. But only one path still has the possibility of delivering the thing players imagine. That is why Squadron 42 matters so much. Squadron 42 is a test. It is where CIG has to prove that all the engine work, all this tech, and all this painful foundation building can actually become a polished game. Not just a sandbox, tech demo, or a beautiful mess. A finished, cinematic, authored campaign. If Squadron 42 launches and feels seamless, physical, cinematic, immersive, and technically ambitious in a way Starfield did not, then the conversation changes overnight. But suddenly the question becomes, what's the cost of doing something different? And if the answer is yes, then a lot of the last decade starts to look different. Not perfect or excused or above criticism, but just different. Because there's a massive difference between wasting time and building technology that takes time. There's a massive difference between future creep and foundational ambition. There's a massive difference between delaying because you cannot finish and delaying because the thing you are building does not exist yet. CIG still has to prove which one of these that is the truth, but Starfield gives us new lens. It shows us that shipping a space game is not enough. It has to feel like space. It has to feel connected. It has to make the ship matter. It has to make the journey matter. It has to make the universe feel like more than a menu with pretty backgrounds. That is why Star Citizen, for all of its flaws, still has people holding the line. Because when it works, it does something Starfield never quite did. It makes you believe in the universe is real. You can criticize the bugs, delays, funding, management, never-ending wait. But the first time you walk through your ship while your friend is flying it through atmosphere, the argument changes. The first time you load cargo by hand, take off, quantum jump, get interdicted, survive, land, and sail the run, the argument changes. First time you stand on the moon and watch another player's ship descend through the clouds, the argument changes. That is not a loading screen, it's not a cell, a menu, or a promise, but it's what we wanted. And that is what Bethesda could not fake with Starfield. So maybe Star Citizen development has been painful because CIG refuses to build the fake version. Maybe they looked at the shortcuts and decided those shortcuts will eventually become walls. Maybe they understood that if you build the wrong foundation, no 2.0 update can fully save you. Maybe Starfield proves them right. Not completely and not yet, but enough to make the conversation worth having. Because in the end, it's not really about Starfield versus Star Citizen. It's a bigger question. What matters more in game development? Shipping faster with limitations everyone can feel, or taking the long, brutal road to build the technology required for the fantasy you promised? Bethesda shows one path. CIG shows another. Starfield showed us the dangers of compromising. Now Squadron 42 has to show us whether the long road was worth it. And if it does, if Squadron 42 lands, Star Citizen eventually stabilizes, if CIG can turn all this technology into a real, reliable, finished universe, and the story may not be that Star Citizen took too long, the story may be that everyone else tried to get space without building the ship first. That is the real lesson. You can fake a lot in games. You can fake distance, planets, travel, scale. You can even fake a universe. But eventually players feel the seams. And once they feel them, they stop believing. Starfield's problem was not that it had seams. Every game has seams. Starfield's problem was that the seams were exactly where the fantasy needed to be strongest. Star Citizen's entire gamble is that those seams can be removed. That is why this project still matters. That is why people still care. That is why the debate never died. If CIG fails, Star Citizen becomes the ultimate warning about ambition without delivery. But if CIG succeeds, Star Citizen becomes the proof that sometimes, the only way to build the future is to ignore the safer path and build the engine that the future requires. And after Starfield, the argument is stronger than it has ever been.